This video is brought to you by Nebula. In the early hours of Friday morning, something happened in Iran. We're not entirely sure what, because Israeli and Iranian officials are currently saying different things, but it looks like at least a handful of Israeli drones were shot down in the Iranian province of Isfahan, which is home to both Iran's 8th Tactical Air Base and the Natanz nuclear site, Iran's primary enrichment facility. At the time of writing, however, it looks like no damage has been done, which bodes well for anyone worried about an escalation or a regional war in the Middle East. So in this video, we're going to look at what's happened over the last 48 hours or so, why these events suggest that a regional war is now relatively unlikely, and why that still leaves the US with a difficult dilemma. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a super quick recap. Last weekend, Iran fired hundreds of drones and missiles at Israel in retaliation against a suspected Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria, which killed one of the IRGC's top military commanders. The consensus among well-versed analysts seems to be that Iran was escalating in order to eventually de-escalate. In other words, Iran felt it had to do something to deter further escalation by Israel and appease the more hawkish elements of the Iranian public. But their response was calibrated to satisfy these two criteria without provoking a further escalation from Israel. This is why Iran's attack was big on symbolism. It was the first ever direct attack on Israeli territory, and it involved a massive number of drones and missiles, but relatively small on substance. Only a handful of missiles made it through, and the strikes were telegraphed well in advance. There were even reports that Iran explicitly forewarned the Israeli military about the strikes, which Israel refused to deny. This is fundamentally because, for reasons we've outlined in previous videos, Iran can't afford a war at the moment. Despite rising oil revenues, its economy is in a mess, and its leadership is deeply unpopular with the Iranian public, which is especially problematic given the looming succession crisis once the 85-year-old Ayatollah Khomeini, whose birthday was actually on Friday, finally steps down. Anyway, conscious of these dynamics and anxious about the risk of a regional war in the Middle East, Israel's allies quickly began urging restraint in the aftermath of the attack. In the immediate aftermath, US President Joe Biden called for a, quote, diplomatic response and said Netanyahu should treat it as a win, given how little damage was actually done. A few days later, British Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, who's recently emerged as one of the more vocal Western critics of Israel, urged Netanyahu to be, quote, smart, and said the UK wouldn't support a retaliatory strike against Iran. The day after Cameron's intervention, French President Emmanuel Macron called for, quote, a limit to avoid an escalation, and said the Western response to Iran's attack should be centred around sanctions and diplomatic isolation, rather than resorting to military means. Unsurprisingly, this talk didn't go down too well with Netanyahu, or his government, who insist that they would make their own decision when it came to how they'd respond. And in the early hours of Friday morning, we found out what they'd decided. At the time of writing on Friday morning, it looks like Israel launched a series of limited strikes against Iranian targets, mostly around the city of Isfahan, with a couple more around the city of Tabriz in the northwest. There were also reports of strikes against Iran-linked targets in southern Syria and the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. There's some confusion over the type of strike involved. ABC and CBS reported that Israel had used missiles in the attack, citing US officials, but Iranian state media claimed it was only a drone attack, and all the drones were shot down. This might be because the US officials are talking about the strikes in Syria and Iraq, while Iranian officials are only talking about the strikes in Iran. But whatever happened exactly, it's clear that this was very much a restrained response from Israel. Iranian media is claiming that all the drones were shot down and no damage was done, and IRGC officials are apparently currently posting memes about the size of Israel's drones on their social media. Iranian airspace is already fully reopened, and the Financial Times is reporting that Western officials are privately claiming that the attack was deliberately limited to avoid further escalation. Israel's response so far has also been remarkably muted, with lots of no comments, and an Israeli official even told the Jerusalem Post that they wouldn't take responsibility for the attack, quote, for strategic reasons. This is conspicuously different to the forward-leaning strategic posture we've come to expect from Israel. You'd usually expect these sorts of strikes to be followed with a whole load of furiously bellicose rhetoric from Israeli officials, and the fact that Netanyahu is demanding radio silence suggests that Israel doesn't want to go any further. While this response might not satisfy the more hawkish elements of Israeli society, Itamar Ben-Gvir, for instance, has already criticised it as weak. Its limited scope does mean that the chance of further escalation, let alone a regional war, between Israel and Iran now look significantly lower than they did a week ago. So what explains this apparent dovishness on Israel's behalf? Why was Netanyahu willing to escalate and blow up an Israeli consulate last month, but unwilling to escalate as aggressively this month? Well, it could be the response from Israel's allies, who made it clear that they wouldn't support a further military escalation. It could just be the Israeli government responding to public opinion. Polling carried out by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem this week found that 52% of Israelis thought the country shouldn't respond at all to Iran's drone and missile barrage, presumably because they want Netanyahu to focus on the ongoing war in Gaza. But neither of these explanations are 100% convincing, because, well, Netanyahu has thus far been pretty much unresponsive to both international pressure and Israeli public opinion. Another potential explanation worth mentioning is that Netanyahu and Biden have done a slightly dodgy deal over Rafah, the city in South Gaza where something like 1 million displaced Palestinians are currently taking refuge. On Thursday, a Qatari newspaper, The New Arab, citing senior Egyptian officials, reported that America had agreed to approve Netanyahu's prospective invasion of Rafah in exchange for a limited response by Israel against Iran. The report has since been published by a number of Israeli news outlets, prompting a firm but nonetheless conditional denial from the State Department, who said late on Thursday that the US would not support any invasion of Rafah that does not factor in the 1 million people seeking refuge there. Nonetheless, even if the report is incorrect and the US haven't signed off on anything, an invasion of Rafah still now looks more likely than it did, both because Israel is no longer preoccupied with Iran and because Netanyahu will feel under pressure to do something to appease the more hawkish elements of his cabinet. That's not the end of this story either. So if you want to dive deeper into this and other stories, we have an exciting announcement. That's because it was revealed, in Variety no less, that we're building a new product with our partners at Nebula, called Nebula News. Let me explain this exciting announcement. In an increasingly polarised and confusing world, it's hard to find news that matters and that you can trust. So every day, the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now, handpicking a feed of content which should keep you up to date with everything you need. That means no more overwhelming feeds of news coverage, and instead just the stories that matter most. Videos produced by the brilliant creators on Nebula and curated by the TLDR team. It's truly the easiest way for you to keep on top of the news that matters to impress at your next wedding, dinner party, or whatever your life entails. It's not just curated news content brought to you directly by us. Nebula also features exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you're already subscribed to Nebula, you can find the brand new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out. Thanks for your support, especially when we're doing something so big and new, and we hope you love Nebula News.